We usually think of history in terms of maps, arrows, and massive armies moving across continents. We look at the grand dates and the names carved into marble monuments. But history isn't just a collection of dates. It's a collection of choices made by individual human beings when the world around them has completely lost its mind. If you walk into the small, forgotten town of Obernault, tucked away in the dense, fog-covered valleys of Bavaria, you won't find it in most history books. It's a quiet place where the cobblestones are slick with morning dew and the pine trees stand like silent sentinels against the gray sky. For decades, the people who live here have kept a secret. It's a secret about a meeting that took place in the bleeding, chaotic final days of World War II. A meeting that was never recorded in any official military log, but one that altered the lives of everyone who witnessed it. It is the story of what General George S. Patton said to a high-ranking Wehrmacht officer who thought he could hide his sins behind a clean uniform and a chest full of medals. To understand how that meeting happened, you have to understand the man who was running Obernault in the spring of 1945. His name was Major Dieter Vance. If you saw Vance walking down the street before the war, you would have thought he was a gentleman. He was tall, meticulously groomed, and spoke with the refined accent of old Prussian nobility. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a schoolteacher or a banker. But Vance possessed a cold, terrifying trait that made him highly effective in the worst possible way. He believed completely in efficiency, and he lacked even a single drop of human empathy. When the German war machine began to collapse, Vance was put in charge of a temporary holding compound just outside Obernault. It wasn't a sprawling concentration camp. It was a makeshift stockade built inside an old limestone quarry. There were no gas chambers there, just barbed wire, mud, and 3,000 Allied prisoners of war, mostly Americans and British soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Vance looked at these 3,000 human beings not as men, but as a logistical problem. And as the supply lines broke down, he decided on a very simple, very quiet solution. He would just stop feeding them. While Vance sat in his warm, oak-paneled office in the town hall, eating fresh bread and drinking captured French wine, less than a mile away, men were eating grass. They were chewing on their own leather boots. The quarry became a silent pit of despair. The local villagers knew something was wrong. They could smell the decay carried on the wind, and sometimes, in the dead of night, they could hear the faint, ghostly sound of thousands of men coughing in the dark. A young German girl named Elsa, who worked as a maid in Vance's headquarters, tried to slip a piece of bread to a prisoner who was cleaning the courtyard. Vance caught her. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He simply walked over, took the bread from her hand, threw it into the mud, and told Elsa that if she ever showed mercy to the subhumans again, she would find herself on the other side of the wire. That was the kind of man Dieter Vance was. He believed that power meant the right to decide who lived and who died, and he was convinced that no one would ever hold him accountable because he was always careful to follow orders. But the world was moving faster than Vance's ledgers could keep up with. By April of 1945, the American Third Army was tearing through Germany like a thunderbolt. General Patton was driving his armored divisions forward with a ferocious, almost manic energy. He wasn't just trying to win a war. He was trying to crush the very spirit of tyranny. The men of the Third Army were exhausted, covered in grease and dust, but they didn't stop because Patton wouldn't let them. He was a man driven by a profound sense of destiny and a deep, burning hatred for cruelty. In his mind, a soldier who fought bravely on the battlefield was an honorable adversary, but someone who mistreated the helpless was a coward who deserved no quarter. As the American tanks closed in on the region surrounding Obernault, Vance realized the end was near. But instead of freeing the prisoners or trying to save them, he did something incredibly sinister. He ordered his guards to destroy all the camp records. He wanted to erase the names of the dead, to pretend that the 3,000 men in the quarry had never existed. It was during this frantic cleanup that Elsa overheard a conversation between Vance and his top deputy. The deputy was panicking, pointing out that the Americans were only 20 miles away and that the prisoners were dying by the dozens every hour. Vance calmly lit a cigarette and looked out the window. He told his deputy that the Americans were soft. He said that when they arrived, he would present himself as an honorable officer who had simply run out of supplies. He would tell them that the conditions in the camp were the fault of the Allied bombings, not his own choices. He truly believed that his high rank and his polished manners would shield him from the consequences of his actions. He was preparing a lie so smooth, so perfectly crafted, that he thought even the fiercest American generals would accept it. What he didn't realize was that the man heading straight for his town was not a typical general. The morning the Americans arrived, the fog lay thick over Obernault. The sound came first, a low, rhythmic rumble that shook the window panes in the town hall. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of dozens of Sherman tanks rolling down the main road, their iron tracks grinding against the cobblestones. The villagers hid behind their curtains, terrified of what the conquerors would do. Vance stood in the center of the town square, wearing his dress uniform, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his medals pinned neatly to his chest. He held a small white flag in his gloved hand. He looked like a man attending a military parade, not a man surrendering a conquered town. A single jeep pulled ahead of the tank column. It stopped right in front of Vance. The dust settled, and from the passenger seat stepped a man with 2 pearl-handled revolvers strapped to his waist and 3 glittering stars on his helmet. General Patton had arrived. Patton didn't look at Vance at first. He looked around the town square, his sharp, piercing eyes taking in the clean streets, the well-fed faces of the few locals who had ventured out, and the pristine condition of the buildings. Then, his gaze snapped to Vance. The German officer stepped forward, executing a flawless military salute. He spoke in fluent, elegant English. He welcomed the general to Obernault and stated that he wished to formally surrender the town and his garrison under the terms of the Geneva Convention. He added, with a practiced sigh of regret, that he hoped the general would bring immediate medical aid, as a terrible typhus outbreak and the unfortunate disruption of supply lines by Allied bombers had caused great suffering in a local holding area. He played the part of the tragic, overwhelmed administrator perfectly. Patton stood there, his riding crop tapping gently against his leg. He didn't return the salute. He didn't speak. He just stared at Vance with an intensity that made the German officer's smile falter slightly. Patton's face was like granite. He turned to his aide, a young captain named Miller, and told him to get in the jeep. He looked back at Vance and told him to get in too. He said they were going to look at this holding area together. Vance felt a sudden knot of anxiety in his stomach, but he quickly dismissed it. He told himself that he had destroyed the papers, that there was no proof of intentional starvation. He climbed into the back of the jeep, maintaining his rigid, dignified posture. The drive to the limestone quarry took less than 5 minutes, but for Vance, it felt like an eternity. As the jeep approached the outer perimeter, the smell hit them. It was a thick, suffocating stench of sickness, waste, and death. Captain Miller gasped, pulling his handkerchief over his nose. Patton didn't flinch. His face grew even harder, his jaw locking so tight the muscles stood out. When the jeep finally stopped at the edge of the quarry, the scene below was something out of a nightmare. Thousands of men, hollow-cheeked, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls, their clothes hanging off their skeletal frames like rags on scarecrows, were lying in the dirt. Some were too weak to stand. When they saw the American uniforms, a few tried to cheer, but the sound that came out of their throats was a dry, rattling whisper. Patton stepped out of the jeep and walked down into the mud of the quarry. He didn't care about his polished boots or his clean uniform. He walked right up to a young American soldier who was leaning against a wooden post, his legs too weak to support his weight. Patton knelt in the dirt beside him, taking the boy's filthy, trembling hand in his own. He asked the boy his name and where he was from. The boy whispered that he was Corporal Thomas from Ohio, and then, with tears streaming down his dirty face, he said they hadn't eaten a single piece of bread in 3 weeks. He said the guards had thrown water over them when they begged for food. Patton sat with that boy for a long moment, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful fury. Vance remained at the top of the quarry, watching the scene. He began to walk down, keeping his distance from the filthy prisoners. He approached Patton and started to speak, his voice maintaining that calm, reasonable tone. He said it was a tragedy of war, that he had repeatedly requested rations from Berlin but had received nothing. He said he did the best he could with the resources available. Patton stood up slowly. He turned around to face Vance, and for the first time, the German officer felt a genuine chill of terror. Patton didn't yell. He didn't scream. When he spoke, his voice was a low, vibrating growl that carried across the silent quarry, loud enough for every prisoner and every guard to hear. Patton walked until he was standing just inches from Vance's face. He told Vance that he had seen a lot of things in his life. He had seen men torn apart by artillery. He had seen cities burned to ash. And he had seen the raw, brutal reality of combat. But he said he had never seen anything as vile as a man who uses the uniform of a soldier to hide the soul of a murderer. Vance tried to speak, to protest his innocence, but Patton slammed his riding crop against Vance's chest, cutting him off instantly. He told Vance to shut his mouth. He said that an honorable enemy fights on the battlefield with a weapon in his hand, but a coward starves men behind barbed wire because he is afraid to look them in the eye when they are strong. Then, Patton did something completely unexpected. He turned to Captain Miller and gave an order that stunned everyone present. He told Miller to go back to the town of Obernault and round up every single civilian over the age of 14. He ordered him to bring the mayor, the shopkeepers, the housewives, and the teachers down to the quarry. Vance looked confused. He asked Patton what the civilians had to do with this, claiming they knew nothing of the camp's operations. Patton looked at Vance with a smile that was completely devoid of warmth. He told Vance that if the people of this town wanted to pretend they didn't see the smoke or hear the cries, he was going to make sure they smelled the truth. He said they were going to see exactly what kind of man they had allowed to lead them. Within an hour, the townspeople of Obernault were marched down to the quarry. They came in their Sunday clothes, looking bewildered and frightened, escorted by heavily armed American soldiers. When they reached the edge and looked down at the thousands of walking skeletons, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. Women covered their faces, and men looked away in shame. Patton stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the entire assembly. He pointed his riding crop down at the prisoners and then at Vance. He shouted to the townspeople, telling them to look at the work of their glorious Major Vance. He told them that these prisoners were sons, brothers, and husbands who had fought bravely, only to be treated worse than animals by a man who claimed to represent the greatness of Germany. But Patton wasn't finished with Vance. He turned his full attention back to the Major. He told Vance that since he loved efficiency so much, he was going to give him a brand new assignment. He announced that starting right now, Vance was personally responsible for the survival of every single man in the quarry. He told Vance that for every prisoner who died from this moment on due to neglect, Vance would pay with his own life. He ordered the German guards to be stripped of their weapons and handed shovels. He told them they were going to dig proper graves for the men who had already perished, and they were going to do it under the direct supervision of the very men they had starved. Vance's polished composure completely shattered. He looked at his beautiful uniform, now splattered with the mud of the quarry, and looked at the angry, weeping faces of his own townspeople. He realized that his carefully constructed wall of lies had collapsed in a matter of minutes. He tried to appeal to Patton's sense of military fraternity, asking to be treated as an officer of equal rank. Patton spat on the ground near Vance's boots. He told Vance that he didn't see an officer standing before him. He saw a thief who had stolen the lives of helpless men, and he promised Vance that before the sun went down, he would learn exactly what it felt like to be completely powerless. Patton then ordered the American supply trucks to be brought forward. He didn't wait for official bureaucratic approval from headquarters. He commanded his men to unload every ration, every blanket, and every medical kit they had. He looked at the townspeople of Obernault and told them that they had two choices. They could either sit there and watch, or they could go back to their homes, bring every scrap of food, every clean sheet, and every drop of milk they possessed, and help save these men. He told them that their actions today would determine how the world remembered their town. Prompted by Elsa, who was the first to step forward, the villagers began to run back to the town to gather supplies. As the chaotic, beautiful work of salvation began, Patton walked back over to Vance, who was being guarded by two massive American military policemen. Patton looked at the broken German officer one last time. He told Vance that the ultimate tragedy of men like him is that they believe brutality is a sign of strength. But Patton said that true strength is the ability to hold power over life and death and choose mercy, justice, and honor. He told Vance that the uniform he wore didn't make him a soldier. It just made his crimes more visible to God and to history. With that, Patton turned his back on Vance, leaving him to face the judgment of his own people and the men he had tried to destroy. the story of Obernault didn't end that day. Over the next few weeks, thanks to the fierce intervention of Patton's army and the sudden, guilt-driven labor of the townspeople, thousands of lives were saved. The quarry was transformed from a place of death into a testament to human resilience. Major Vance was eventually tried by a military tribunal, his erased records reconstructed through the testimonies of the survivors and the young maid, Elsa. He spent the rest of his days behind the bars of a prison, stripped of his medals, his titles, and his dignity, remembered only as a coward who was exposed by a general who refused to look away from the truth. Today, if you visit the quiet valley of Obernault, you will find a small, understated monument near the old limestone quarry. It doesn't list the names of generals or celebrate a great military victory. Instead, it bears a simple inscription dedicated to the memory of the men who suffered there and the reminder that justice is not just found in the outcome of wars, but in the words and actions of those who refuse to let cruelty go unanswered. It stands as a reminder of that morning in 1945 when a legendary general reminded an arrogant officer that no amount of polished leather or high status can ever wash away the stain of a cold heart. Because in the final accounting of history, the victories that truly matter are the ones where we choose to preserve our humanity, even when the world around us has lost its own.